Today we're talking to Suzanne Buckley, who's a speech and language therapist working in the NHS. So Suzanne's going to be answering some questions on speech and swallowing problems in MS. So thank you so much for talking to me today. So the first questions are around speech problems. So can you talk through what type of speech problems that you come across in people with MS, first of all?
Yeah, no problem. So the most common type of difficulty that we see is a motor speech difficulty called dysarthria. And that can cause speech to sound slurred or too quiet or too fast. And so speaking loudly, slowly and clearly can be something that can actually be learned and practiced to improve how well you're understood by others. In terms of how common it is, so this difficulty, dysarthria, can occur in around 50% of people with MS, but rarely do we see it when people are first diagnosed. There can be many different types and combinations of dysarthria, so it's important that your speech and language therapist explains to you what's happening so you can focus on the specific aspects of your speech that's most unclear. For example, if lingual sounds, so those are the sounds that your tongue makes, like or n, if they're reduced in clarity by practicing and focusing on those specific sounds and speech movements, that can make a huge difference. It can make a really big difference.
So you spoke a little bit there about the different types of speech problems that you come across. Can you talk about what's actually causing those speech problems in MS? So what's sort of going wrong?
Yeah, so speech, as a therapist, and a lot of my colleagues would say it's just the most incredible, wonderful thing. It's our most human characteristic, and it's without a doubt, and I'll say this over and above all my physiotherapy colleagues and my OT colleagues, it's the most highly skilled activity that we do, and we do it without even thinking. So imagine, not even the greatest concert pianist playing this incredibly beautiful arpeggio can come close to the refined movements that go into producing speech. And what it involves the precise and the rapid coordination of more than 80 different muscles, many of them paired. And your brain does all of this by sending and receiving 1,400 motor commands a second. And so the complexity is vast, but to help us to understand it better and to help us to explain it to people better, we like to kind of break it down into 5 separate parts. And so if I think about the first part, so respiration, that's a hugely important foundation for speech, and this obviously involves the air from our lungs, without which we would just be mouthing words. The second part would be phonation, what we call phonation, and this happens when air from the lungs vibrates your vocal cords, and that produces sound. And without that vibration happening, all you would be doing would be whispering. And then the third part, we have articulation, and this is when we shape that air that's coming up through our lungs, and we're shaping it into consonants and vowels depending on the shape of the shape that you make with your lips or your tongue or opening your jaw. And without this shape happening, we would just be going ah. And then we have resonance. And this is when we can control the nasal tone of each sound that we make. And we do this by raising and lowering the velum, which is the soft palate, right at the back. And without that ability to kind of move the palate up and down, you would sound, quite stuffed up. So it sounded quite nasal, or conversely, you would sound quite hypernasal, which is something that we call when a lot of the air kind of escapes out through the nose, and reduces that, what you can say and the power of, the speech sounds that you make. And then the fifth element is something that we call prosody. And this helps us to convey meaning or emotion by kind of changing the stress and the intonation and the melody of what we say. And without that kind of variation in tone, you're going to sound quite robotic. So that's all of the components kind of combined. And if any of those within that system is disrupted, it can result in a speech impairment or a voice disorder. Knowing which one or ones are impaired will help your therapist determine what they're kind of focusing on, what they need to treat in therapy.
Thank you. That was a really, really nice overview, and it's amazing how much actually goes into being able to speak. And I suppose it really highlights actually the fact that with MS, I'm guessing MS can affect sort of any of those aspects of speech. The next question was around, so you mentioned about speech slurring and voice and reduced voice strength and volume already. So what actually can help with those problems if you're struggling with that?
Yeah, so there can be techniques such as speaking slowly, over exaggerating, your speech sounds, having good posture. All of those things can be hugely beneficial to you kind of being heard and not feel as though you're endlessly repeating yourself. Often we tell people to imagine yourself on stage, kind of giving a performance. And by thinking in this way, it automatically makes you think big. You're kind of projecting your voice, and you're thinking about your posture, you're thinking about your breath support, and you slow your speech down, and that all helps to produce that, the best clarity. What's also important is that your communication partner also understands that they also have a role to play. And they can help by doing things like facing you, reducing any background noise or any distractions like the TV or the radio, repeating back the bits that they heard, so that you don't have to repeat it right the way from the beginning again. All of these little tweaks can contribute to an overall improvement. Your therapist might recommend conversation training, which has proved to be highly effective treatment for people with dysarthria. With a weak voice or a quiet kind of voice volume, if that's the problem for you, then your therapist could offer a treatment that has quite a strong evidence base, and that's something called the Lee-Silverman voice treatment. Which is commonly used for people with Parkinson's, but I could see that could also be quite useful for people with MS also.
You also mentioned conversation training as well. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so there's this fantastic, it's part of UCL, and they called it Better Conversation. So it started out with people with what's called aphasia, which is language difficulty, rather than a speech, but they've extended it into better conversations with people with dysarthria, and essentially again it's those same simple techniques, that kind of education and training in terms of how to maximize the most successful interactions. So kind of, it's a lot of it involves video. So, you would be asked to video friends or family and yourself talking, and then you would have the chance in a safe space and safe environment to kind of talk through what went well, what could be tweaked, what could be better, and the end result is that you've worked on something that's long lasting. It's these little tweaks, these bits of knowledge that will carry through.
The next question was around sort of difficulty remembering words. Sometimes we have people contact us that do struggle with this. So do you have any tips if people are having problems sort of in a conversation thinking of a word?
Yeah, so difficulty with word finding is more of a cognitive, more of a language difficulty rather than a motor speech difficulty, as I mentioned earlier. So it's not that you've not remembered the word, or that the word's just lost. It's more about struggling to retrieve it. So it's that tip of the tongue feeling that we've all experienced, where it's almost there, but there's just something that's blocking it from being found. You know, we've all experienced them, but if you're experiencing them repeatedly, then, you know, it can be hugely frustrating. And for some reason, it tends to be objects or people. Quite often, you know, commonly it's people or places that are the tricky words. And I often hear, when I see people with word finding difficulty, I often hear them describe how when they're particularly stressed or tired, or they're under pressure because they're feeling that intense need to get their message out, it can have a really, you know, a detrimental effect on finding the right word at the right time. And a lot of what I do, and it's easy for me to say, but reducing that pressure on yourself when you're faced with that kind of situation where a particular word can't be found, by reducing that pressure, you're better able to manage it. And if you think about it having taken, like, if it's taken longer than a few seconds to get to the word, your brain has effectively kind of taken you down a path, and it's got a brick wall at the end. Okay, so you need to reverse back, back up the path, and you've got to find yourself a different route. And you do that by kind of talking around the word, describing where you might find it, what it looks like, anything that just helps you to kind of circumvent that block, that barrier. And you might actually also be lucky and have somebody lovely and friendly that you're talking to that's going to help you too, you know. The other thing is that those psychological techniques, such as owning, you know, what's happening to you, and normalizing it, and, or, you know, just allowing yourself that control back, you know, helps you to kind of feel more in control. So not being, you know, just saying, you know, completely, you know, with no apologies, complete transparency, you know, look, I've got difficulties finding the right words sometimes because of my MS. That in itself will just give you the chance to kind of own the situation, and that's going to help boost your confidence no end. I'd highly recommend people do that.
Yeah, and I think it stops you sort of beating yourself up and feeling stressed and then sort of spiraling from there.
It's just that vicious cycle, isn't it? That if you can just be, it's that kind of clever technique to just sort of stop that cycle, and it's gaining back that control of the interaction, and just being like, you know what, it's going to happen, you know, you can help me find the word or I will get there eventually, just bear with me, you know. Yeah, I
think that's a really, really good approach for people to try and practice. My final question on speech problems was around technology. So is there any technology available to help with people that have speech problems?
Yeah, so there's a wealth of assistive technology out there that can enhance learning, you know, so at university, at school, working, you know, all of your day-to-day interactions. For those who have a persistent difficulty with face-to-face communication, having a therapist who's skilled in something that we call alternative and augmentative communication, so that's AAC, that can be a really big help. So I think actually just asking your therapist how confident they are in AAC is a good first step. Because it is an area of specialism, and if it's something that they don't have or they're developing, which can be the case, then another thing that you could do is contact the Communication Matters charity. There's also a charity called ACE Centre, and that's ACE, ACE. Or there's also the Assistive Technology Industry Association. They're all experts in the field. And they often have groups that you can email out, and you can ask hundreds of people who have an interest in AAC or assistive technology, and you can ask them for ideas or information that, questions that you just need to know. And they, I have a group myself. I think it's on the Communication Matters group, and they are so lovely, and everybody's so, so helpful, and there's no silly question. There's no silly question at all. And it's specifically for people who live in England, and specifically for people who have not just complex speech difficulties, but also complex physical disabilities, so difficulties with hand dexterity, with arm movement, all of those things that are going to impact on accessing kind of, your standard off-the-shelf devices like an iPad or, your own laptop or your phone. There is a specialised service. There's about 13 in the country, in England, that are commissioned by NHS England that can help you. Mm-hmm. And they fund high-tech communication devices, and they'll fund the communication software that you need on those as well, and they'll fund the mounting system that you might need. So, for example, like the poles that connect a communication device to a wheelchair, or a floor mount, those kind of things. So if they do have very specific criteria, but if you are eligible for their service, you don't need to pay. But you do need to be referred by your NHS speech and language therapist. If you're not eligible, there are other funding routes, such as charitable funds or your local NHS service. Your speech therapist should be able to help.